Hello, my name's Serena and today I'm going to be discussing Kant's Transcendental idealism and the Copernican revolution. We've already heard a bit about Kant's moral philosophy from Paula's lecture last week, but today's lecture I'm going to be focusing more on Kant's metaphysics and his epistemology. This is respectively the study of reality and the study of knowledge. Now, the arguments that Kant puts forward in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is the book I'm going to be focusing on today, entails what he calls transcendental idealism, and his account of the possibility of knowing objects is what philosophers call the Copernican revolution. Now, like Copernicus, who discovered that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not the other way around, Kant claims that we must look at the subject for the possibility of knowledge, and not the objects themselves. If you recall in Paula's lecture, she mentioned that Kant was writing at a time when there was a debate between the rationalists such as Leibniz and Descartes and the empiricists such as Locke and Hume. Now, in addition to this, there was also another ongoing debate between the materialists such as Hobbes and the idealists such as Berkeley. I'm going to explain these positions in more depth shortly, so don't worry about these terms too much just yet. But the reason why I find Kant so important and fascinating is because he's the kind of person who, instead of supporting any kind of philosophical football team, he would instead argue that both sides are actually required for any kind of game to be played in the first place. At the time of writing, what we call the Enlightenment was celebrating some extraordinary human achievements. For example, Isaac Newton was able to conclude that not only was gravity responsible for objects on Earth, but also for the rotation of celestial bodies. Now, the rationalists argued that these achievements are only possible due to the capacity of reason that humans possess. Their general claim is that knowledge is gained through reason rather than through experience. They claim that we rely on principles known a priori, that is, prior to sensory experience, in order to deduce claims about nature, which then fit into our rational system of thought. However, these scientific discoveries also revealed that nature was quite mechanistic, and could potentially undermine the tenets of rational thought as they were previously considered. Empiricists, on the other hand, claimed that when we learn about the world through our senses, it is then that the true mechanics of the world are revealed. And indeed, the Newtonian method took observations about the world and then derived mathematical or scientific truths from them. Now, the Critique of Pure Reason, which was the first of 3 critiques that Kant wrote, after a long period of not publishing anything at all, was in part to respond to this crisis and ongoing tension. The Critique of Pure Reason, as the title suggests, is an attempt to criticise the rationalist notion that pure reason is the source of all knowledge. Kant had previously published extensively on rationalist philosophy of the time. This includes plenty on philosophers such as Leibniz and Wolff. But actually, he famously stated it was Hume, who, if you recall, is an empiricist, who awoke him from his dogmatic slumber and motivated him to make this Copernican turn. Now, Hume was very sceptical of the idea that we can rationally assert facts about nature. In particular, Kant was impressed by Hume's skepticism of causation. How do we rationally know that one thing causes another, as we only know that one thing frequently occurs after another, and that's empirically? I have seen plates, for example, smash when they fall to the floor. But how can I be certain that one day a plate will not smash when it drops to the ground? It's incorrect to infer causation, when we've not actually witnessed causation itself, but merely the repetition of events succeeding other events. How can I conclude that it necessarily happened that way? Hume remained sceptical about causation, as he believed that we can't learn it through experience, and he disagreed with rationalism because he thought it was not able to reflect any certainty about events, nor could we reason that nature is uniform. the best we can do is make inductive inferences. Kant realised that Hume had correctly identified that neither experience nor reason could be solely responsible for our knowledge of the world, but he didn't want to accept that the conclusion was that we don't have any knowledge of things like cause and effect. So what was his solution? Kant offers us the following structure of cognition. On one hand, we have the understanding. This faculty, or part of our thinking, let's say, deals with concepts and reason. On the other hand, we have the faculty of sensibility, which deals with intuitions. Sensibility dealing with experience and intuitions, which can be thought of as representations of sensory data that we receive. What differentiates Kant from previous philosophers is that not only does he place importance on both these faculties, but he also proposes that we have something called a priori intuitions. That is, intuitions which belong to the faculty dealing with sensory experience that are in fact prior to any sensory experience. We have what he calls pure a priori intuitions. Now these are space and time. Kant argues, contra people like Newton, that space and time are not actually objective features that exist out there in the world, but rather he claims that space and time are necessary intuitions that we impose upon our experience in order to structure that experience. From these pure a priori intuitions, we also get something called synthetic a priori knowledge, such as mathematics and geometry. He claims that it is only possible to know geometrical truths, for example, by having an a priori understanding of space. But this cannot belong to the faculty of understanding, as space is not a concept. Yet it certainly isn't something we learn about through experience, as we are able to work out geometrical and mathematical problems without this pertaining to particular corresponding objects. In this sense, Kant has created a bridge between the empiricists and the rationalists, as the application of the a priori is also used in our sensory experience of the world, and not just within our use of reason. Furthermore, Kant believes that this is the only way we can solve Hume's problem for causation, as it means we have shown empirical events are necessary, but their necessity is known a priori, but not through reason, but as part of the structure of our experience. This is possibly the most controversial part of Kant's philosophy, and people debate to great length about how the synthetic a priori is possible. Furthermore, now Euclidean geometry, that is, the geometry that Kant believes is a priori, is no longer our best theory of geometry, and as a result, can we really say that space is a pure intuition? I'm going to leave these questions for you to consider, but now I'm going to explain the implication of this Copernican revolution, and that is transcendental idealism. As I mentioned, Kant thinks that the possibility of knowing objects is through a structure that we impose. We receive intuitions from the world, but these are also structured through our a priori intuitions of space and time. I also mentioned earlier in the lecture the other ongoing debate at the time that Kant was writing. This is the metaphysical debate between idealism and materialism. They were arguing about what the nature of reality is. The materialists believe that reality is structured from matter, or physical stuff. However, the materialists seem to explain how it was we could have knowledge of this stuff, and why our thoughts about this stuff even exist in the first place. The idealists, on the other hand, believe that the world is mind-dependent. That is, everything exists as a result of our thoughts, and that includes objects around us, which would normally be considered matter. However, the idealists were charged with solipsism, which is the inability to prove the existence of other minds, and generally being quite a wacky philosophy, which often ended up relying on, say, God's existence to prove that this isn't some far-out dream. Now, there are also people like Descartes who are substance dualists, and they thought that our thoughts are made up of the mental mind stuff, and that there are also all the material stuff composing the physical world. But he was never able to explain how the two sets of stuff could interact with each other. For instance, I stub my toe and I think, ouch, that hurts. But that's two kind of metaphysical stuff which don't really seem to have a reason to causally affect one another. So if Kant thinks that our cognition structures the way we experience reality, that implies in one sense that reality is dependent on our minds, but also that we do in some way receive an external reality which exists in order for us to structure it. He argues that there are two kinds of reality, the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. The phenomenal world is the world that we experience, or the world of appearances, and it is structured spatio-temporally, and is thought of by oneself. And I experience this phenomenal world. The noumenal world, on the other hand, is unknowable by us. This is the world beyond our cognition. We will never experience things not structured by our cognition, so we can never really know what things in themselves are. For all we know, they are very different, or perhaps they're quite similar to what we experience. The only real clue we get is that space and time are things we impose, so the noumenal world is not spatio-temporal, at least not that we know of. So Kant is both an empirical realist and a transcendental idealist. He is a realist about the objects we experience as structured by our cognition. These objects truly exist, but as they are objects of our experience. But he's an idealist about the phenomenal world, which he thinks is mind-dependent. The reason he calls this transcendental idealism is because it's a transcendental argument. The possibility of empirical realism is only possible if we infer that the phenomenal world is structured by our cognition and that there must be a noumenal world beyond this. Now, it's important to remember it's not idealist in the sense that in order to exist, something must be mind-dependent. Rather, Kant is saying that in order to exist as an empirical object, or something that is experienced, it must belong to the phenomenal world, which we know is structured by cognition. That concludes my lecture on Transcendental Idealism and the Copernican Revolution. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye bye.